Welcome to Introduction to SQL for Excel Users, Part 20, Basic Subqueries. I am your instructor, Dave Langer. This video will be completely in SSMS, and that's because the subject of the video, SQL subqueries, doesn't really have a good analog in Excel world, so it's just better just to stay in SQL and cover it here. Okay, so this query that you see that I'm going to highlight is from part 19, the previous video in this series, and it is pretty simple. It's got a CTE in it, and it calculates the data that we saw at the end of part 19, as you can see down here. We have our sales reps, how many sales they made, the count of how many sales they made in the first 90 days, and the total amount of sales that they made in the first 90 days. Now we're going to continue with this hypothetical scenario. I'm the AdventureWorks sales manager, and I have a hypothesis that sales reps that sell a lot in the first 90 days tend to do better at the 1-year mark of their employment than those that do not. And we're going to use this as a vehicle to explore the idea of subqueries. But the first thing I want to talk about is this highlighted query right here, and specifically this inner query. As we know from a previous video, CTEs allow us to define one or more inner queries that produce a virtual table, and then it allows us to give that virtual table a name, so then we can reference it, we can work with it. So you can see here in the outer query, this part right here, I'm using the name of the virtual table that's defined up here as if it were a real table in the database, and that's totally cool. Now, in reality, what's going on behind the scenes, technically speaking, is a CTE is just a nice way to wrap up what's known as a subquery. So this inner query here in the CTE is also, technically speaking, a subquery. And I don't have to write the code like this. For example, I could literally just take this chunk of the code, the inner query here, and actually replace sales rep data with all of this code directly. And it is totally legit. It's what's known as a subquery, and it's totally fine. Let's take a look at that. So this is the equivalent form of the query that we just saw. Now notice right here, I've taken the query that was wrapped up in the CTE, and I've put it in between some parentheses. I just literally cut and pasted the code from the CTE into the parentheses, and then I just gave it an alias. So I could literally just run this query. I can just highlight everything between the parentheses, and I can execute it, and I get back a bunch of information here. This is the raw data. And then I can say, look, you know what? This is a virtual table. It's a virtual table. And I can give it an alias, just like any other table. So, hey, SQL, select from this subquery using this alias SRD. Oh, and by the way, I want you to group by SRD sales rep. And if I run the whole thing, we get exactly the same output as we saw from the query above. But notice this, right? This right here produces a virtual table. It produces a virtual table. I just wrap it up in parentheses, make it a logical thing, and then I can also give it an alias. And as far as SQL's concerned, this is a virtual table like anything that comes from a CTE or a collection of joins. It doesn't matter. So subqueries are extremely important. You see them all over the place, whether they're explicit, like we have here, or the subquery is implicit, like we have here with a CTE. Regardless, they are both subqueries, make no mistake. Now, the reason why we use CTEs will become clear later on in this video, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and keep working this analysis scenario, but using only subqueries. I'm not going to use any CTEs at all. Okay, so let's go ahead and move down to the next version of this query. So this is also legit. Notice that I've got the SRD subquery right here. I can highlight it right here, subquery. But notice this, I've interjoined another subquery here. So if we go back up here real quick, notice that the SRD subquery, the thing that's highlighted, uses an inner join to dim employee. You know what? just to be silly, just to be goofy, just to be kooky, I'm going to replace this with a subquery just to show you that you can get pretty ugly with your queries if you really want to. So instead of just doing an inner join directly on dim employee, I said, hey, I want you to do an inner join on the results of this subquery. Now, this is extremely silly. It's extremely silly. I'm freely admitting that. I'm just selecting star from dim employee, but I'm doing this to prove a point. I'm showing you that you can have subqueries within subqueries, within subqueries, within subqueries, within subqueries, if you want to. Essentially, any place where you produce a virtual table, you can replace it with a subquery if you would like. So I don't have to inner join directly to dim employee. I probably should. That would be considered best practice. If I wanted to be silly, I could write the code this way in SQL. Says, you know what, Dave? That's totally awesome. If you want to write your query that way, go right ahead, knock yourself out. And notice we get back exactly the same data. But notice that I've got a subquery inside of a subquery. And SQL loves it just fine. No problemo. However, notice how ugly my code's getting. Notice that this is so much harder to understand and keep track of what's going on compared to the original query using a CT. This is nice. This is very, very nice. I like it. But let's get really silly. Let's get really silly before we clean all this up with CTEs. Okay? So I can build a query like this. Okay? And let's unpack this step by step. So we know that logically speaking, SQL processes froms and joins first, right? It builds the virtual table before it filters with where, before it group by, and before it selects. Cool. So we're going to go ahead and just unpack this. So we know we've got SRD 365, and SRD 365 is this query right here, this subquery wrapped up in parentheses. So let's just run it real quick and see what it does. So I'll just highlight all this, hit execute. Okay. All right, sweet. So this is pretty simple. What's happening is that we're grabbing all the records from fact reseller sales, right? In this inner query, from fact reseller sales. We're inner joining to dim employee. And then we're grouping by the employees and their sales order number and their order date. Okay, so what we're doing is we're collapsing the multiple records in the sales order table into a single sales order per sales rep. That's what we're doing. Single sales order per sales rep. Okay, great. This is awesome. Okay. And our select list says concat the first name and last name together, so it's nice and neat. Last name, comma, first name. Great. Give me the sales order number. I'm only going to get one of these because I'm grouping by sales order number. I'm casting the order date as a date. I'm summing up the sales amount everywhere, and I'm summing up whether or not the sale was made, whether this individual sale was made in the first 365 days. Okay, cool. And down here in the data, you can see here that Amy Alberts has two orders right here. This first order was for almost 50 grand. This one was for about 33 grand. But notice she didn't make these in the first 365 days. She made them after her first year of employment. Whereas you can see David Campbell here, he made a sale for almost $43,000 and it was made in his first 365 days. Okay, great. So essentially this inner query, this subquery, is grabbing all of the sales orders for all of the reps and basically adding up all the sales order line items and to make it one big amount for the sales order, and then saying yes or no, 1 or 0, was this sales order made in the first 365 days of employment? Okay, cool. And notice I'm using 364 here, as I did in the last video, using the logic of, well, if you make a sale on your very first day, the date diff will be 0. So we want 0 through 364. Okay, sweet. So we wrap all of this data up and call it SRD 365. We then say, okay, only where 365 is equal to, sale made in the first 365 days is equal to 1. We only want to keep those. Group by the sales rep. And if I run this whole thing, this says, okay, basically, within the first year, what's the count of the sales orders made and what's the total aggregate amount? And you can see here that Mr. Syed Abbas made 12 sales in the first 365 days for a grand total of $151,257 and about 12 cents. Awesome. Cool, right? So this is our first step. We want to investigate the hypothesis of if you're a sales rep and you just got hired for AdventureWorks, and what was your sales performance in the first 90 days? And then we're going to compare it to what you did at the year mark. So the first thing we're doing here is we're grabbing all of the sales reps and see how they did at the 1 year mark. And you can see here, for example, down here, Rachel Valdez, or Valdez, not quite sure how to pronounce that. We'll call her Valdez. Miss Valdez. Rachel Valdez sold 120 orders for a grand total of about $1.8 million. Pretty nice. Okay, cool. Now here's the thing. This alone won't work as such, because what I need to do is I need to structure this entire query so that I can do a left join to it. And here's the reason for it. I'm going to make an assumption that every sales rep makes at least one sale within the first year. All of them make a sale. They make at least one sale within the first year. I'm going to make that assumption. But I'm not going to make an assumption that everybody makes a sale in the first 90 days. So what I'm going to use this query to produce is my left table, right? My left virtual table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to left join to this table produced by this query everything in the first 90 days, because I want to make sure I keep all of these records, because I'm making an assumption that everybody makes a sale in the first year, but not everyone makes a sale in the first 90 days. And I'll left join to this table the 90-day data. It's easier if we just see the code. So let's go ahead and see the code. Okay, so notice what I'm doing here. That previous query, I'm just wrapping all up as a subquery here. Notice I even got the where clause, everything. Now, notice how kooky this is, right? And how ugly this is. This is a subquery called SRD 365. Awesome, okay, cool. But notice this, I've got a subquery inside of it, also called SRD 365. Ooh, I didn't grab all the first parenthesis there. Ooh, okay, SRD 365. So I have a subquery called SRD 365, and inside of that subquery, it in turn has a subquery called SRD 365. Notice that's totally legit. I can totally do that. Because what I'm doing here is I'm doing the first stage of aggregation. I'm aggregating at the employee hire date sales order number order date level. That's this first SRD 365. But then I need to aggregate that again where sales made in the first 365 days is equal to 1, and then I'm grouping by the sales rep. So if I run this, I'm going to get the same data that we already have down here. Cool. But now that I've wrapped this all up as one big old subquery, I can now left join. This produces a virtual table. I can make this my left virtual table, and then I can left join the 90 days to it, the 90-day data. So if I just do this, and you're basically going to get the same data that you see before. Boom, okay, no problem. Great. So let's move on down a little bit here. Okay, so this is the final version of the subquery, or final version of the query using subqueries. And look how ugly this bad boy is. Look how ugly it is, okay? So first up, SQL says, there's the from. Cool. What am I going to do? Oh, Dave wants to execute a subquery, which he wants to alias SRD 365. This subquery also contains a subquery, alias SRD 365. This produces essentially the data at the year mark. The 1 year mark for all the sales reps, that's what this subquery produces. Okay, and I'm calling it SRD 365. And again, I'm making an assumption that every sales rep makes at least one sales order in their first year. So this becomes my anchor point, essentially. That's why I'm making it the left virtual table. Sweet. Now I can left outer join to this virtual table that's highlighted the 90-day data. And let's unpack this. So I've got a subquery, which I'm calling SRD 90, but notice that the subquery of SRD 90 includes itself a subquery called SRD. And what am I doing here? Well, I'm doing the query that we saw from part 19 of the series, where I'm essentially aggregating all of the data at the 90-day mark at the employee, hire date, sales order number, and order date level. So this is the first stage. I've got to aggregate the sales orders up to a single record for every sales order number. And then when I do that, I can then group again where the sales order was made in the first 90 days. And I call that my SRD90. That is my right virtual table that I'm left outer joining to my left virtual table on sales rep name. Notice I'm joining up the sales rep on the SRD365 subquery to the sales reps from the SRD90 subquery. And then I can order by the sales reps here. So if I run this monstrously ugly query, I get back the data, and here we go, right? And we can kind of eyeball the data here. And we can say, okay, cool, look. Syed Abbas and Stephen Jiang, I'm going to hopefully pronounce those correctly, made no sales at all. See that with the nulls here? In the first 90 days. And at the 1 year mark, they made 90 grand and 151 grand. Not great. This is not great. And generally speaking, you could see that for those folks that make more money, more sales in the first 90 days tend to do better overall. You see that only 90 grand here, only 151 grand here, only 161 grand here. And then you can see some folks are making some big money here. Like here's somebody that made, how much? Almost $1 million here, over 900 grand. And they sold 200 grand in the first 90 days. Okay, so what this is showing is actually maybe there's some truth to this hypothesis, which is the opposite of the conclusion we made at the end of the last video, by the way. So this is cool. Now this is cool because this provides some interesting information to me as the sales manager regarding what's going on with my sales force in terms of 90-day performance being indicative, correlated, predictive of 1 year performance. But the only problem is look at this SQL. Look at the SQL I had to write using just subqueries to get this thing to work. It's ugly. It is ugly. As you might imagine, even though this is totally legit, and you could build this up piece by piece if you want to, it's hideous. It's going to be hard to maintain. Imagine if I gave this code to somebody else, they'd be like, good God, what is Dave doing here? Holy cow. So even though this is totally legit SQL and you can write it this way, this is not considered best practice. Best practice is to use CTEs. And as I mentioned quite a few videos back, one of the primary reasons to use CTEs is not because they give you better performance or because they're more legitimate. It's just because it makes your code easier to write and easier to maintain. So let's take a look at this query, this highlighted monstrosity here, written in CTE terms. Look how much cleaner this is. So much cleaner. Here's the final outer query. Look at that. So smooth. It's so easy to understand what's actually going on here. And each constituent piece is broken out and is much easier to understand what's going on. So here's my sales rep data. So if I just run this real quick, I can understand what's going on. Cool. This basically just grabs me all of the individual sales order grouped by the employee, their hire date, the sales order number, and order date. It's easy peasy to understand. Here's the sales rep's performance. Look, I'm pulling from sales rep data, and all I'm doing is saying, look, check all the dates and make me some data here out of this. Awesome. This is great. Now, I can't run this directly because notice that it's accessing sales rep data. But what I can do real quick is just comment these things out like this. And now I can just highlight the portion that I want to run, and boom, I can see what this particular subquery, this particular CTE is doing. It's grabbing all of Amy's orders and essentially saying, was it made in the first 90 days? Yes or no? How much? Was it made in the first 365 days? Yes or no? How much? Awesome. I'll just uncomment this out real quick. And now we can take a look at all this. Just makes real sense. Notice how elegant and clean it is. Now, if I highlight the whole thing, I can run it and I get back the original information. Okay, that's it for this video. Subqueries. Be aware that they exist, understand that they're legitimate SQL, and generally speaking, avoid them if you can. Use a CTE. Wherever you can, use a CTE, use a CTE, use a CTE. I can't stress that enough. It just makes your code so much easier to read, so much easier to understand, so much easier to maintain. And you'll also have less bugs, by the way, just so that you know. Okay, I'm hoping you're liking the series, that you're getting value out of it. If you are, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I will be producing more content regularly on SQL until this series is done. Not quite sure when that's going to be, but it's going to be at least 10 more videos, I would think. Until next time, please stay healthy, and I wish you very happy data sleuthing.